Chapter 1. The Returned One. You saw him before he entered the bar. The glass door reflected a familiar figure, distorted like a ghost from the dead. Jean Servier, the man everyone thought was dead, or at least insane, was standing in the fog, soaking wet, his cloak smelling of mold and sea fish. He walked in. All conversation stopped. The beer glass in Emma's hand fell silently to the floor, shattering. Only the yellow dog howled from somewhere in the back of the kitchen, a long, hoarse sound, as if it couldn't quite believe it was coming back. You don't remember who stood up first. Maybe it was Maigret. Maybe it was Léon. But Maigret sat there, his pipe unlit, his eyes narrowed, not because of the light, but because of something in Servier's eyes. A silence that came not from trauma, but from calculation. I don't remember much, Servier said, his voice hoarse like gravel scraping his throat. I was held in an unknown place. All I remember is the sound of chains and the smell of bleach. Maigret did not reply. He had seen too many men come back from the darkness, some broken, some lying to the point of believing themselves. But Servier was different. He did not tremble. He did not ask anyone anything. He just looked around, as if checking who was alive and who was dead. Who had you? I didn't see them. What did they do? Just ask me about Michaud and Maigret. The room was cold, as if someone had drained the heat. Michaud was dead. Maigret was white. Emma backed away from the counter, her hands shaking, but she kept her eyes on Servier's. And that's when you know. No one in this room believes Servier. Not necessarily what he says, but the way he looks, like an archaeologist silently examining the ruins he once buried. Maigret approached and whispered, and the dog? Do you remember it? Which dog? Servier's laughed softly, as if it were a joke. Ah, that yellow dog, I think. He knew too much. It was a moment that made everyone shudder, not for the answer, but because of the way he said it calmly, coldly, as if the dog really was the only surviving witness. Chapter 2. The second person has fallen down. The next morning, the smell of salt still clung to the old stone walls of Concarneau. The sky was gray, and the gentle waves lapped the shore, whispering of something that had happened during the night, something quiet, persistent, and inevitable. Emma found the envelope under the door after opening the shop. It was a short note, handwritten in smudged black ink. The second man is down. The dog will be on guard tonight. Count the shadows, not the light. No signature. But someone had drawn a symbol at the bottom of the page, a small circle with a slash through it that looked like a severed head. Emma, pale and trembling, took the paper and handed it to Maigret. He was sitting in a rented room, his hand cupped around his cold pipe. He read it, paused, then nodded as if confirming something only he knew. Who in town is the second person, he asked. The answer came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Maigret's body was found, hanging from an electric pole next to the fishing port, asphyxiated. No signs of a struggle, no blood, only a hemp rope tied around his neck, and a round black ink mark on his forehead. No one saw who did it. No one heard the screams, but everyone knew whoever sent the letter did it. The yellow dog appeared again, this time It sat in front of Emma's door, guarding like a soldier, not barking, not moving, just staring down the alley where Maigret had lived. It didn't need to point. All eyes were on Jean Servières. Servières was drinking coffee in the tavern, leafing through a newspaper with one hand and fiddling with a small folding knife with the other. He looked at Pomeret's death as if it were the inevitable conclusion of a game of chess that had been played long ago. Maigret entered and sat down in front of him. "Have you read the papers?" "No." "Anything hot?" Pomeret is dead. "So, the second one has fallen?" Servière curled his lips. "Who's next? Do you think?" Maigret looked at him. "A long time. I think," he said, his voice hissing through his teeth, "that you are playing cat and mouse. And I am not the mouse." Outside, the yellow dog kept its eyes on the window. It knew. And if anyone in town dared to look the truth in the face, it was Maigret. But what he was facing was not just a murderer. It was someone who wanted to rewrite the rules of the town in blood. Chapter 3. The Stranger from Krakow. That night, Concarneau was shrouded in a thin mist, a mist that did not come from the sea, but seemed to come from the darkest recesses of memory. Maigret sat brooding in his room, staring at his cold pipe. He was used to murders, but not this kind of murder. No apparent motive, no threats, no gunshots, just riddles and deaths written out of a morbid play. Near midnight, a knock came at the door, soft but steady, as if the person knocking knew he was expected. Maigret opened the door. There stood a man in a long, ash-colored cloak, with deep-set eyes, hair as black as burnt velvet, and lips slightly pursed, as if holding back a past. "Inspector Maigret." "Who are you?" "I'm Andrzej Jaskowiak, former journalist, Krakow. I've come for Servières." Maigret invited him in. Andrzej sat down, pulled out an old photograph. 3 men in military uniforms of unknown nationality, standing in the middle of a dilapidated street. In it was clearly Jean Servière younger, but with the same dark eyes as now. Jean was a war correspondent, but he didn't just write. He did more. "What do you mean? In 1922 in Galicia, a town was burned to the ground. 3 people survived. 1 was me, 2 was a boy, 3 was the commandant's dog. We called him Sauti Paes, the yellow dog." Maigret felt a chill run down his spine. "You mean that dog is real?" "Perhaps not. Perhaps it is only the shadow of sin. But wherever there is Servière, there is death. And a dog goes first." He pulled out a file. There were unpublished articles, photos of mysterious deaths, a scientist in Budapest, a banker in Vienna, a mayor in Lyon. They all had one thing in common. Servières had been there within a week of the murder. Maigret felt the pieces of the puzzle coming together, but in a shape he had never expected. "And I didn't come to help. I came to see him finished, because I know there's going to be a third, and it's either me or you." Maigret did not answer. Outside, the wind blew harder. The windows rattled. When he looked out, the yellow dog was back, sitting across the street, its eyes reflecting the light of the oil lamp, as if waiting for orders. Chapter 4. The verdict under the oil light. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Maigret was awakened by a loud and chaotic knocking on the door. He pulled a pistol from a drawer before opening the door. A porter was panting, his face white, his lips trembling. "Mr. Andre, at number 11. Something happened." Maigret did not wait to hear more. He put on his coat and ran out into the street. When he arrived, the door to Andre's apartment was wide open. The light in the hallway was dim, like melted wax. Blood was dripping steadily on the tile floor down to the desk where Andre lay, a long gash across his shoulder. Muttering something in Polish, a doctor was called immediately. No one saw the attacker. No one heard any noise except a strange screech that one neighbor said like the hoarse growl of a sick dog. Maigret sat by the bedside, listening to Andre's delirium. Fragments of words escaped from his parched lips. Servière, Braille, that year, betrayal, trap, guilty dog. As dawn faded over Concarneau, an envelope was found under Maigret's door. No postmark, no address, just a few words. "Dear Inspector, it is time for you to look at yourself." Zauti-Peace. Inside was a blurry photograph Maigret standing in the doorway of the morgue, his face pensive. The shadow of a dog behind him stretched out like a leash. Maigret sat down in his chair, feeling for the first time in years what he had never accepted fear. Not because of the dog, but because I feel like I no longer have control over this story. Chapter 5, Diary Lines Never Written. Maigret sat motionless at the table, the photograph in his hand shaking slightly in the light of the oil lamp. The photograph could not have existed unless someone had followed him, capturing what seemed to him the most private moment, his last glimpse of death. He opened the envelope again. This time there was a thin sheet of paper hidden inside. The handwriting in brown ink was not shaky at all, but tilted slightly, as if the writer had learned to write standing up. March 19. You let Servières die. No one says anything because of the war, but a dog never forgets who threw him off the boat. Maigret felt a lump in his throat. Servières, Braille, names he had buried deep in the winter fever on the Danube docks, where he had first learned that justice was not always the same as truth, where a friend had been pushed into the shadows to maintain the false order of the system. He pulled out an old diary from the bottom drawer of his suitcase. The hastily written, ink-stained notes recorded that night. But one section was torn out, and now that passage, the passage he never wrote, was coming back to find him. That afternoon, at the Hôtel de l'Amiral, a man appeared, suntanned, with an Eastern European accent, holding a music box playing an old waltz. He walked 3 times around the dining room and left the music box on Maigret's table. When he opened it, music played, and from the bottom of the box, a rolled-up piece of paper emerged on a spring. A hungry dog always returns to where it was beaten. This time, it will bite. That night, another person was attacked, this time Dr. Michaud. A blow to the back of the head that left him unconscious. In the examination room, a message was scrawled in blood on the wall. I remember. You used to ignore me. Maigret understood he was not looking for justice. He wanted Maigret to look at his own guilt. Chapter 6. The voice from the Black River. The torrential rain of the previous night had left the town unusually deserted. Maigret sat in the deserted tavern. Next to him, a bit with dull eyes and salt-seasoned hands, Kovac, a former sailor who now washed glasses at the port of Saint-Nazaire. Kovac, Maigret said slowly, you were in Braila in March 1919. The man did not reply, just lit a cigarette and blew smoke through his chipped teeth. You saw Servières die, but you said nothing. Kovac laughed dryly, a laugh that lacked any humor. We all saw it. But you were the only one who had the authority to order him pulled from the mooring line. You hesitated. The words were like a dull knife, cutting through Maigret's chest. He did not object. I ask you because someone is taking revenge, said Maigret. Not just me, but those who have been silent like you. Kovac put down his glass and nodded slowly. Two others were in France at the time, Blanchard and Yvette. One was a tabloid editor in Paris. The other was a nurse. Both had been on the La Providence that year. Maigret writes in his notebook, a list of targets. But he doesn't kill, not yet. At least, he punishes with hauntings, with truths dragged up from the depths of memories. That night, Maigret returned to his room to find the lock broken. Nothing was missing from the room. Only one thing was added: a yellow, stuffed dog neatly placed on the pillow, its mouth sewn shut with black thread, its eyes embroidered red as blood. At its feet, a piece of paper. Remember when you said, no one will ever know, I know. Maigret sat down, breathing deeply. He was not just a vengeful man. He was a living witness, a loyal dog of memory, gnawing at the remains of other people's cowardice. Chapter 7. The Eyes of the Watchman. The Paris night was pale under the dim yellow light. The rain had just stopped. The streets were slippery, like a coiled snake in the silence. Maigret stood in front of Blanchard's apartment door, 5th floor, a narrow corridor that smelled of damp paper and old ink. The man opened the door warily. He was thin, his hair disheveled, and his hands shook slightly, not from age, but from something else, fear or guilt. Inspector Maigret, I've come about Servières. And what's happened lately? Blanchard swallowed. I know someone is following me. Maigret sat down at the dining table, littered with prints. On the wall was a black and white photograph of Braila, a harbor shrouded in mist. The photograph was taken in 1919. Have you received anything? Maigret asked. Blanchard opened a drawer and took out a piece of paper. The paper was crumpled and the ink was smudged. The dog knows something. It's your turn to hear it bark. Yee. At the same time, he took a small object from his coat pocket, a piece of bandage stained with dried blood. I found it next to the body of my dog, hit by a car. But I am sure it did not run out into the street by itself. It was afraid of the rainy afternoon. Maigret did not speak. The dog's death was only a signal. He did not want to kill people, not yet, but to drown them in his obsession. As Maigret left the apartment, he felt it. Not footsteps, but a presence like eyes on the back of his head. He paused halfway up the stairs, the hallway light flickering. A dark figure stood on the ground floor, motionless. Then, slowly, it turned into a corner. Maigret hurried down, But when he reached it, it was empty. There was only one thing left, an old newspaper, neatly placed on the stair railing. The front page bore a picture of himself, a young photo, just out of the police academy. Handwritten title in red ink, Last Man on Board. Chapter 8, The Last Man on Board. Yvette's apartment is in the Ménilmontant district, a working-class neighborhood where car horns mingle with hawking voices. But tonight, everything is strangely quiet, as if the whole city is holding its breath. Maigret knocked a third time. There was no answer. He glanced down at the lock. No sign of tampering. He took off his gloves and used the tongs to open the lock with a technique he was all too familiar with. The door opened with a slow creak. In the light from the hallway, the apartment looked like a scene left in the middle of a storm. Chairs were overturned, curtains were torn, and unopened letters were strewn across the floor. But what stopped Maigret was the mirror hanging on the wall. On the mirror, draw with bright red lipstick. You abandoned me. Everyone abandoned me. He stepped deeper inside. No bodies, no sounds, just the smell of cheap perfume mixed with the metallic scent of blood, a smell he had learned from decades of work haunting. Unmistakable. On the dresser was a spilled bottle of sleeping pills. A few were scattered across the wooden surface, but not enough to kill. There was a trail of marks on the floor, as if someone had been dragged, feet sweeping through the dust. Maigret called the forensic team. While waiting for them to arrive, he leafed through some papers, old invoices. A few love letters from an unknown name signed only H. One read, "You don't understand, Yvette. Gallet's death was no accident. You must be quiet. We're out." The clock strikes 3 a.m. Then he noticed a small detail in a crack in the wooden floor. There was a piece of torn dark gray cloth, a material that did not resemble women's clothing. Maigret used tweezers to pick it out. Sticking to it was a hair, not Yvette's. Male hair. Black, stiff. As he left the apartment, he saw his old neighbor standing on the stairs, holding a cat. "You looking for Yvette? Someone came to see her tonight. In a long raincoat, boots, didn't say a word, just stood in the doorway." Then she went off with him, like she was hypnotized. Maigret did not answer, but in his head the red words on the mirror echoed, "Everyone abandoned me." No, not suicide. This is an accusation. Someone is taking revenge not for money, not for honor, but for a past betrayal. Chapter 9. The Night Train and the Ghost. The bells ring out from the old Montparnasse station like a wake-up call. Deep beneath Paris, the once abandoned substation is now a place of trash and darkness or unburied memories. Maigret descended the rotten wooden stairs, flashlight in hand, scanning every mossy corner of the walls. He had followed a strange utility bill, paid for a derelict engineering room to this place, below ground level. He stopped before a rusty iron door. A faded sign still riveted to it read, "Logistics Base 6B, inactive since 1927. Maigret pushed open the door. Inside, the space was dark, but there was a faint smell, rotting paper, burning cloth, and candles. On a wooden table in the middle of the room was an old map of the city, marked in red with 3 points, where Gallet had been killed, where Yvette had worked, and a name he had not seen in the files L'Armoire Noire. The black cabinet, Next to it was a cloth-bound file. When he opened it, he found copies of old notes from 1926, typed on an old-fashioned Olympia typewriter. Victim: Gaston Gallet. First reported: February 1926. Suspect: Jules Rouquet, since disappeared. Witnesses: H, Y, B, M. Gaston Gallet, the same name from the murder that Maigret thought he understood. But this file says otherwise. The first murder did not happen in the present, but 18 years ago. Everyone present survived, but together they reenacted the death like a ritual. A noise behind, Maigret turned. A tall man stood there, in a gray cloak, holding a candle. His eyes were sunken, his cheekbones high, as if he had just emerged from the grave. His voice was low and hoarse. "You are too late, Maigret. Everything was decided long ago. The survivors must pay the price." "Are you Rouquet?" asked Maigret. The man did not answer. Instead, he placed an old, yellowed photograph on the table. 4 men stood in a cramped room, light streaming in through the bars of a window. One of them was Gallet. The other was Rouquet, who had never died. In the middle of the cellar, Maigret felt the last pieces begin to tighten like a wound-up watch chain. The killer is not someone new, not someone crazy. It is the last survivor of an old conspiracy, someone who has returned to close the circle. Not for justice, but for something more terrible: memories that cannot be forgotten. Chapter 10. L'Armoire Noire. The rain began to fall heavily as Maigret stepped out of the underground station, his coat darkening under the yellow streetlights. He hailed an old taxi and silently handed the driver a piece of paper with the address: 12 Rue des Trois Frères, Montmartre. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his eyes somewhat hesitant. "L'Armoire Noire. I thought that place closed 10 years ago." "Just go there," said Maigret, softly but firmly. The bar was tucked between 2 abandoned buildings, recognizable only by its chipped black wooden sign. The letter A missing, leaving only Armoire Noire hanging. The iron door was locked, but a new padlock had been installed on the outside. Someone was still coming and going. Maigret used a small metal rod from his inside pocket. There was a click, and the heavy door opened. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and stale wine. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling light, and dust covered the tabletop. But the floor had been recently mopped. Behind the bar was a small passageway leading down to the basement. There, Maigret discovered a narrow room with leather chairs, a wooden table, and an old bookshelf with a single notebook in the centers. Brown leather cover, hand-engraved name, journal, 1926. He opened the diary. The pages were frayed at the corners, but the ink was still intact. In shaky handwriting were recorded each confession. "We know. Gallet killed a man that night. Rouquet kept quiet in exchange for money. I did nothing. Crime goes unpunished. But now we are being hunted. One by one. No one escapes." The last page was a list of 5 names, each crossed out in red ink. Except for Henri Saurin, which was circled, Maigret closed the book just as he heard footsteps above. A figure slipped silently through the crack in the door and disappeared. He drew his pistol and followed it up the stairs. The bar is now as quiet as a grave. All that remains is the notebook and the lingering question, if the killer isn't the one who committed the crime. Is he righting the wrongs, or is he just another part of the old curse, a ghost that never quite goes away? Chapter 11. The last one. The sky of Paris was covered with a leaden gray, as thick as the dust of time that settled in the mind of someone who had lived too long with memories that no one wanted to mention. Maigret stood before the gates of the St. Cyr Psychiatric Institute, where twisted souls were locked up not to be saved, but to be forgotten. The iron gate opened after he showed his papers. A nurse led him through a narrow corridor, low-ceilinged, and the yellow light muffled by frosted glass. Laughter rose from a closed cell and was cut off as if strangled. "Mr. Saurin is in room 19, the nurse said, her voice low, as if afraid the man might hear them coming. Henri Saurin lay motionless on the wooden chair by the window. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes staring blankly out at the withered garden. But when Maigret entered, his eyes were fixed on him, and a crooked smile spread across his haggard face. "You are late. Commissaire, are those deaths enough? You know why I came. I know everything. We deserve to be punished, but not by him." Maigret sat down opposite. "Tell me, Henri, the year was 1926. Gallet, Rouquet, Devernois. Even the name left out of the book. What really happened?" Saurin shuddered, then spoke slowly, as if each word were a needle driven into his memory. "We killed a man, an unknown writer. He wrote about us, about the lies, the embezzlements, about the sudden death of a girl in Montauban. We were afraid, and Gallet did it. He pushed the man off the balcony on a rainy night. But no one was caught. We were complicit by our silence." "And now," Henri chuckled, "they're back, not the police. Someone who wants to rewrite the ending." Maigret got up without asking any more questions. "On the way out," the nurse whispered, "last night, a stranger came here, hooded, didn't say anything, just stood looking at Mr. Saurin through the glass. 5 minutes, then left. Outside, the winter wind whipped at his face as a reminder. The game wasn't over. And this time, the killer doesn't need to hide his blood. He's rewriting history with death." Chapter 12. Final Draft. The next morning, Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the damp cold seeping through the gaps of his coat. On his desk was a brown envelope, without a name or postmark. Only the word Maigret was written in black ink, in a soft but decisive hand. He tore open the envelope. Inside was a thin, weather-worn piece of paper. Not a letter, a manuscript page. Typewritten, with handwritten fragments interspersed. In the right corner, a name was blurred and almost erased: Lucien Delage. Maigret reads, "We sat in that room Gallet, Rouquet, Devernois, Saurin, and decided the fate of a man. He knew too much. He wrote. And his manuscript was the noose for us all. Gallet did it, but the blood is on all of our hands. We think he is dead. We think the Montauban night wind has blown him into oblivion. But no man is truly dead if he lives on in the memory of others. He will return, not in flesh, but in word. And one by one will fall." Maigret sat motionless. The name Lucien Delage did not appear in any of the case files that year. There was no trace of a missing writer, but the manuscript, if genuine, could be the first evidence of a secret that had lain buried for nearly 2 decades. He called Janvier in. Check all the Montauban archives for 1926. Focus on fatal accidents, especially those involving writers. Find Lucien Delage. Yes, commissaire. That evening, when Maigret returned home, a figure stood across the street, silently looking up at the apartment window. Not moving, not walking, just standing there like a statue cast in the darkness. Maigret saw him through the curtains, but he made no sign. He did not call the police. Instead, he took out a cigarette, lit it, and sat down at the table. In front of him was the old manuscript. Beside him were the files of Gallet and Rouquet. If the ghost returned in pages, he would read each line. If the murderer was writing a new story, he, Jules Maigret, would be the one to rewrite the ending. Chapter 13. The Pages That Know How to Kill. Maigret arrived at the crime scene early the next morning. The location, the penthouse of Devernois, a man who had been vaguely involved in the Gallet affair. He had become suddenly rich after 1926, then retired to live in seclusion in the suburbs of Neuilly. Devernois's body hung in the middle of the living room. No fallen chair. No sign of a struggle. It was as if he had stood still, letting the rope strangle him. Maigret looked around. The desk was in disarray. The typewriter had fresh ink stains. The wine glass was half empty. On the table, a single sheet of paper. And then Devernois walked into his own living room, where he had hung the hook many years ago. As a challenge to fate, he knew that one day, the final page would require him to sign his name in blood. There was no author's name, but Maigret was used to that style of writing. Lucien Delage, or someone writing under that name, was reconstructing the old case in fiction. Janvier called from Montauban. Commissaire. There are records from the asylum from 1926. A man lost his memory after falling from the 3rd floor. They call him Louis Dumas, but the signature on admission is L. Delage. Maigret closed his eyes and took out a cigarette, and then he disappeared. No one knows who took him. There are reports of a group of people, including Gallet and Rouquet, showing up at the hospital a few days later. The reason is unclear. In Maigret's mind, the pieces began to fit together. A 1926 murder was more than blood. It was fear, and a writer had documented it all. Not in a police report, but in a novel. An unpublished manuscript that could destroy a small network of power. But now, one chapter at a time, it's coming. And one character at a time, one person involved in the incident is dying. Exactly as described. That evening, Maigret returned to his apartment. On his desk, a new letter. Commissaire Maigret, the next chapter is about to begin. Don't believe anything Gallet says. He's just a puppet. The writer is still alive. And the main character this time is him. LD, Chapter 14. The Diarian. Maigret took the night train to Montauban, carrying only a small leather bag, a pistol, and a strange piece of paper signed LD. He felt no fear, only the feeling that he was reading himself in a novel whose words he could not control. At the old mental hospital archives, the building was cracked, and the tired staff led him into the basement archives. An old woman named Mathilde, the librarian, recognized the name Louis Dumas immediately. I still have something strange. It's not in the files. I keep it because it's like a cry for help that no one reads. Oh. She handed him an old notebook, covered in brown leather, the first line of which was scribbled. I don't remember who I am, but I remember 3 people who smelled of death. Maigret read each page. The paragraphs were short and disjointed, but in the clear voice of Lucien Delage, a man wearing glasses, always clutching a leather briefcase named Gallet. A tall, bearded man, it was Devernois, and the third, standing back, never spoke, only watched. He wore a dark felt hat and an old brown cloak. Maigret closed the book. Lasso. I used to wear a brown cloak. He checked in the hospital staff list for 1926. No one knew anything about the 3 visitors. But on the last page of the book, an unusual line was written in a different handwriting. No one remembers who he was anymore. We call him the writer. But he still writes, in blood, if necessary. Maigret looked at his watch. 3:17 a.m. In the empty hallway, there was a metallic clang against the tile floor. He stepped out. A figure passed through the hallway. No guard, no doctor. Maigret pulled out a gun. Who is it? No answer. But on the wall, there was a black charcoal drawing. Chapter 15. The Fourth Patient. Chapter 15. The Fourth Patient. The round light bulb on the ceiling of the hallway flickered, its clicking sound like a countdown clock. Maigret stood before a room with a half-erased number, 11B. The nameplate had been scraped off, leaving scratches like fingernails on wood. He pushed open the door. Inside was a small room, with no bed, just a worn mattress on the floor. 3 walls were covered with black charcoal drawings, not pictures, but banished memories. A man with a stick, a crying child, a half-mask, and Maigret paused himself, sitting at the table, with a glass of absinthe, a gun by his right hand. The painter was still alive. He sat huddled in a corner, his head bald, his eyes wide open but dull, as if he had seen too much and no longer wanted to see more. His face bore a scar that ran from his forehead to his lip, a misshapen stitch, as if someone had patched it with a trembling left hand. Maigret stepped closer. I'm Inspector Maigret. What's your name? No answer, just a gaze, fixed on the drawing of Maigret hanging. Maigret handed over the notebook from Louis Dumas. You wrote this. The man did not nod, did not shake his head, but his lips moved. Maigret bent down, very softly, like the sound of wind raking in a chimney. I no longer write. He writes. Through me, a chill ran down Maigret's spine. Who is he? The man pointed to the wall, where there was a drawing in dried blood. A man wearing a half-white, half-black mask, holding a brush. But the tip was not ink. It was a syringe. Suddenly, from the vent above the ceiling, came a soft hissing sound. Someone was laughing. Not young, not old. The voice of something that never quite dies memory or regret. Maigret returned to the station and asked for the original medical records. The nurse had only a sealed file. It contained X-rays, an unopened letter, and a single piece of paper with the words printed upside down as if pressed from the inside out. He does not kill to kill. He writes to live. Chapter 16. The Nameless Profile. Maigret sat alone in the nurse's station, the neon light overhead seeming to be sickening, blinking, whining, like the brain of a man about to break apart. Before him was an unopened letter, the paper yellowed, the edges stained with water. The letter was sealed in a hospital envelope, addressed to Dr. Lucien Forge, head of the psychiatric department, St. Ange Hospital, 1926. But the name was crossed out, and underneath was handwritten, passed on to someone who will remember. There was no seal, no stamp. It was never sent, just hidden. Maigret opened the letter. The paper inside was so thin that it seemed to crumble to dust. The words were written in uneven brown ink, as if written with a shaking or bleeding hand. I did not treat him. I translated for him. The words do not belong to this era. His name is not on the records, but his laughter echoes in the empty corridors. Every patient's dream has him in it. Every time the ink runs dry, there is blood on the walls. In the bottom corner of the letter was an unnamed symbol, a black and white, bisected circle like the one on the wall of room 11B, 2312. Maigret returned to the eastern wing of the hospital, which had been closed since 1932 after an unrecorded fire. He found the heavy metal door, sealed with old wax and chains. A musty smell, mixed with rust, rose as he picked the lock. The hallway inside was dark, but one last door was left ajar, as if waiting for him. On the door is an old bronze plate, therapy writing room for anonymous patients only. Maigret pulled out his flashlight. The floor was dusty, but there were footprints fresh. He walked in. There was no bed, no operating table. There was only a desk. On it were dozens of old notebooks, all of which contained the names of patients who had died before they were admitted to the hospital. Maigret opened a random book. The first line was written in red ink. I don't write their memories. I write their deaths before they happen. Then he heard a light scratching behind him. He turned. In the corner of the room was a locked bookcase. On the top shelf was a metal box, a box of old quills. Blood oozed from the lid.